Now, if we had to decide, I said, which of these elements would do most to make our city good by its inclusion, that would be a difficult decision. Is it the agreement of the rulers and the ruled? Or the preservation in the ranks of the warriors of an opinion approved by law about which things are to be feared and which are not? Or the wisdom and protectiveness we find in the rulers? Or does the largest contribution to making the city good come from the presence, in child and woman, slave and free man, in skilled craftsman, ruler and ruled, of the principle that each single individual is to perform his own task without troubling himself about the tasks of others? Yes, that would be a difficult decision, he said. Bound to be. So, as a means of producing an excellent city, the ability of everyone to perform his own function is apparently a strong competitor with the city's wisdom, self-discipline, and courage. Very much so. Now, see if you agree with me about the next step. If a carpenter tried to do the job of a shoemaker, or a shoemaker the job of a carpenter, either because they exchanged tools and positions in society, or because one person tried to do both jobs, do you think in general that changes of this sort would do much harm to the city? No, not really, he said. But I imagine it's different when someone who is naturally a skilled worker or businessman of some kind is puffed up by wealth, popularity, strength, or something like that, and tries to enter the warrior class, or when one of the warriors tries to enter the decision-making and guardian class without being up to it. If these people exchange tools and positions in society, or if one person tries to do all these jobs at the same time, then I think you will agree with me that this change and interference on their part is destructive to the city. Yes, it certainly is. It is the interference of our three classes with one another, then, and interchange between them, which does the greatest harm to the city, and can rightly be called the worst crime against it. Absolutely. Isn't injustice the name for the greatest crime against one's own city? Of course. That, then, is what injustice is. Conversely, its opposite, the ability of the commercial, auxiliary and guardian classes to mind their own business, with each of them performing its own function in the city, this will be justice, and will make the city just. Yes, I think that's exactly how it is, he said. And is a just man just, Glaucon, in the same way a city was just? He is. We haven't at any point forgotten, I hope, that the city was just when each of the three elements in it was performing its own function. No, I don't think we've forgotten that, he said. In that case, we must also remember that each one of us will be just and perform his own proper task when each of the elements within him is performing its proper task. Yes, we must certainly remember that. Isn't it appropriate for the rational element to rule because it is wise and takes thought for the entire soul, and appropriate for the spirited element to be subordinate, the ally of the rational element? Yes. Won't a combination, as we said, of musical and physical education make these two elements concordant? They will bring the rational part to a higher pitch with their diet of improving stories and studies, while at the same time toning down the spirited part by gentle encouragement, calming it by means of harmony and rhythm. They certainly will, he said. When these two elements are brought up on a diet of this kind, when they truly receive the teaching and education appropriate to them, then the two of them will exercise control over the desiring element, which in any individual is the largest element in the soul, and left to itself the most insatiable where material goods are concerned. They will keep a close eye on it, to make sure the satisfaction of the body's so-called pleasures doesn't encourage it to grow great and strong, stop performing its own function and throw the life of all of them into confusion by its attempt to enslave and rule over elements which it is not naturally equipped to rule over. They will indeed, he said. A very close eye. Aren't these two elements also the best defenders, for body and soul in their entirety, against external enemies? One makes the decisions, the other does the fighting, under the leadership of the ruling element, using its courage to put those decisions into effect. True. The title brave, I think, is one we give to any individual because of this part of him, when the spirited element in him, though surrounded by pleasures and pains, keeps intact the instructions given to it by reason about what is to be feared and what is not to be feared. Rightly so, he said. And the title wise, because of that small part which acted as an internal ruler and gave those instructions, having within it a corresponding knowledge of what was good, both for each part and for the whole community of the three of them together. Exactly. What about self-discipline? Isn't that the result of the friendship and harmony of these three? The ruling element and the two elements which are ruled agree that what is rational should rule, and do not rebel against it. Yes, that's exactly what self-discipline is, he said, both for a city and for an individual. And a person will be just, finally, by virtue of the principle we have several times stated. It determines both the fact and the manner of his justice. Yes, inevitably. In that case, I said, do we find justice looking at all blurred round the edges? Does it seem any different to us from what it was when it showed up in the city? Not to me, it doesn't. In which case, do you still want justice to be anything more than this power which can produce both men and cities of this calibre? No, that's more than enough for me, he said. In that case, we have seen the final realization of our dream. Our suspicion that our very first attempt at founding our city might possibly, with a bit of divine guidance, have hit upon both the origin and some sort of model of justice. Yes, we certainly have seen its realization. So this principle, Glaucon, that if you are a shoemaker by nature, you should confine yourself to making shoes, if you are a carpenter, you should confine yourself to carpentry, and so on, really was a kind of image of justice, which is why it was so useful to us. Apparently so. But the truth is that although justice apparently was something of this kind, it was not concerned with the external performance of a man's own function, but with the internal performance of it, with his true self and his own true function, forbidding each of the elements within him to perform tasks other than its own, and not allowing the classes of thing within his soul to interfere with one another. He has, quite literally, to put his own house in order, being himself his own ruler, mentor, and friend, and tuning the three elements just like three fixed points in a musical scale, top, bottom, and intermediate. And if there turn out to be any intervening elements, he must combine them all and emerge as a perfect unity of diverse elements, self-disciplined and in harmony with himself. Only then does he act, whether it is a question of making money or taking care of his body or some political action or contractual agreements with private individuals. In all these situations, he believes and declares that a just and good action is one which preserves or brings about this state of mind, wisdom being the knowledge which directs the action. An unjust action, by contrast, is any action which tends to destroy this state of mind, ignorance, in its turn, being the opinion which directs the unjust action. You're absolutely right, Socrates. Well then, I said, if we were to say we had found the just man, and the just city, and what justice really was in them, we couldn't be said to be totally wide of the mark, in my view. The only question now remaining for us to answer, it seems, is which is more profitable, just actions, good behaviour, and being just, whether the just person is known to be just or not, or unjust actions, and being unjust, even if the unjust person gets away with it and never reforms as a result of punishment. Now that justice and injustice have turned out to be the kinds of things we've described, that seems an absurd question, if you want my opinion, Socrates. When the body's natural constitution is ruined, life seems not worth living, even with every variety of food and drink and all manner of wealth and power. Is someone's life going to be worth living when the natural constitution of the very thing by which he lives is upset and ruined, even assuming he can then do anything he likes, apart from what will release him from evil and injustice and win him justice and virtue? "You're right," I said. "It's an absurd question. Still, now that we've got to the point of being able to see as clearly as possible that this is how things are, this isn't the moment to take a rest. No," he said, "the last thing we should do is to show any hesitation. This way, then, if you want to see what I believe to be the forms taken by vice. The ones worth looking at, anyway." "I'm right behind you," he said. "Speak on." "Well, now that we've got this far in our discussion," I said, "it looks, from my vantage point, as if there is a single form of virtue and any number of forms of vice, of which 4 are worth mentioning." "Please explain," he said. "If you think how many types of political regime there are with their own specific form," I said, "that's probably how many types of soul there are." "And how many is that?" "5 types of political regime," I said, "and 5 types of soul." "Tell me which they are," he said. "All right. I would say that one type of regime is this one we have just described, though there are 2 names it might be given. It might be called monarchy if one exceptional individual emerges among the rulers, or aristocracy if several emerge." "True. This one, then, I class as a single form," I said. "It makes no difference whether it is several who emerge or an individual. Given the upbringing and education we have described, they would not disturb any of the important laws of the city." "No, that wouldn't be sensible," he said. I was about to embark on a systematic account of the way I thought the various categories developed out of one another, when Polemarchus, who was sitting a little bit away from Adeimantus, reached out a hand and took hold of his cloak up at the shoulder. Drawing Adeimantus towards him, he leaned forward and started whispering to him. All we could hear of it was, "What shall we do? Shall we let it go?" "No," Adeimantus replied out loud. "What, in particular," I asked, "do you not want to let go?" "You." "What in particular that I have said?" "We think you're taking the lazy way out, short-changing us out of a whole line of thought, and an important one, in the argument, to save yourself the trouble of explaining it. You think that when it comes to women and children, you can get away with a casual remark to the effect that friends will hold things in common, as if no one could be in any doubt about this." "Wasn't what I said correct, then, Adeimantus?" "Yes, it was," he said, "but like the rest of our correct statements, it needs some explanation. What do you mean by common? There are lots of possibilities, and you're not going to get away without telling us which one you mean. We've been sitting around here patiently, assuming you were bound to say something about the production of children, what their practice will be in this regard, and how they will bring the children up once they are born, and this whole business you've suggested of women and children being in common. We think it's of great indeed crucial importance for our state whether this is done in the right way or the wrong way. So when you started to deal with another regime before settling these questions in a satisfactory way, we made the decision you heard us making, not to let you go until you have given a full description of this topic, like the other topics." "Count me in as well," said Glaucon, "as a joint proposer of this motion." "Take it as a unanimous decision, Socrates," Thrasymachus added. "In that case," I said, "I'd better go back and deal now with something I should perhaps have dealt with earlier, in its rightful place. Our intention, I take it, was to make the men in our hypothetical city into some kind of guardians of the herd. Yes. Shall we follow that up, then, by giving them a birth and upbringing consistent with this role? Shall we see whether or not that suits our purpose?" "What do you mean?" "I mean this. Do we think female watchdogs should do their share of watching in the same way as male watchdogs? Should they do their share of hunting and join in other activities? Or do we think that bearing and raising puppies makes them incapable of doing their share? Do we expect the females to stay at home indoors while the males do the work and have the whole responsibility for the flocks?" "We think they should join in everything," he said. "We treat the females as weaker, though, and the males as stronger." "Well, then, is it possible to employ one animal for the same tasks as another without giving it the same upbringing and training?" "No, it's not possible. So, if we're going to employ women for the same tasks as men, we must give them the same teaching." "Yes. The education we gave men had a musical and poetic element, and a physical element." "Yes. So women, too, should receive these two disciplines, plus military training, and they should be treated in the same way." "It looks like it," he said, "from what you've been saying." "Much of what we are saying now is pretty unconventional. It may well seem absurd if our suggestions are really going to be put into practice." "Indeed, it may." "What do you find the most absurd thing about it? Isn't it, obviously, the idea of women taking exercise naked along with men in the wrestling schools? Not just young women, but older ones as well, like the old men you find in the gymnasiums. They're all wrinkled and by no means a pretty sight, but they still retain an enthusiasm for taking exercise." "Yes," he replied, "that would certainly look pretty absurd, at least the way things are at present. Well, now that we've brought the subject up, we mustn't be afraid of all the standard jokes we'd hear from humorists if we introduced changes of that sort in physical exercise, in musical and poetic education, and particularly in carrying arms and riding on horseback." "You're right," he said. "And since we have brought it up, we must get on to the difficult business of legislation, with a request to these comedians to be serious. We don't mind them not performing their own proper function. We can remind them that it is not so very long since the Greeks thought it immoral and absurd, as most foreigners still think it, for men to be seen naked. When first the Cretans and then the Spartans started exercising naked, all that became a legitimate target for the humorists of the day. Don't you agree?" "I do. I take it that once experience showed that you can do all these activities better, stripped, than wearing clothes, then, too, the perception of absurdity evaporated in the face of public recognition of what was best. It became clear that only a fool regards as laughable anything other than what is bad. Anyone who tries to be amusing by pointing at any spectacle other than the spectacle of folly and wickedness must quite seriously have set himself some standard of beauty other than that of the good." "Exactly," he said. "Well, then, if we want a woman to become guardian material, we shall not have one education for making men guardians and another for making women guardians, shall we? Particularly when they have the same natural attributes to start with. No, we shall have the same education for both. Now, here's another point I'd like your opinion about." "What is that?" whether you feel in your own mind that one man is better and another man is worse. Or do you think all men are the same? No, I certainly don't. Well then, in the city we founded, which do you think we shall find turn out the better men? The guardians who have received the education we described, or the shoemakers trained in the art of shoemaking? Well, that's a fatuous question, he said. I see. What about the rest of the citizens? Aren't the guardians better than all of them? Much better. What about the women? Won't the women guardians be the best of the women? Again, he said, much the best. Is there anything better for the city than for it to have its women and its men alike become as good as possible? No, there isn't. And will this be brought about by the availability of musical and physical education of the kind we described? Of course. So our arrangements are not only feasible, but also in the best interests of our city. Yes. They must strip, then, the women among our guardians. Virtue will be their cloak. They must play their part both in war and in being the guardians of the city in general. That and nothing else. And of those tasks, women should be given lighter ones than men, because their sex is weaker. Absolutely. Can we say, then, that in our provisions for the legal position of women we have survived the first wave of criticism? In laying down that our male and female guardians should in all respects lead a common life, we have not been completely overwhelmed. That's certainly no small wave you have survived, he said. You won't think so when you see the next one. Go on, then. Let me see it. I believe that this law and the others which preceded it imply a further law. What law? That all these women shall be wives in common for all these men, that none of them shall live as individuals with any of the men, that children in turn shall belong to all of them, that no parent shall know its own child, no child its own parent. Yes, he said, when it comes to scepticism about the feasibility or utility of this proposal, that is a much larger wave than the first. I don't imagine there could be any disagreement about its utility. No one would deny that, if it is possible, having wives in common and children in common is a major benefit. But on the question of its feasibility or otherwise, I suspect there would be a lot of disagreement. There'd be plenty of disagreement, he replied, on both counts. Be that as it may, for the moment I'll assume our proposals are feasible. With your permission, I want to examine the way the rulers will organize these things when they do happen, and show that putting them into practice would be of the greatest possible benefit to the city and its guardians. I want you to help me make a thorough examination of those questions first, and leave the other questions until later, if that's all right with you. It's all right, he said. Begin your inquiry. Very well. It will be your job, just as you selected the men, so now to select the women as well, as similar as possible in nature, and allocate them to the men. Since houses and dining halls will be communal, and no one will possess any private property of this kind, the sexes will live in close proximity, and in this state of universal proximity, both in their physical education and in the rest of their upbringing, their natural instincts will inevitably, I think, lead them into having sex with one another. Or don't you regard that as inevitable? Well, it's not a mathematical inevitability, but it's a sexual inevitability, and for the majority of people that is probably a keener agent of persuasion and attraction. Much keener, I said. Now for the next point, Glaucon. In the city of the blessed, haphazard sexual intercourse is unholy. Like haphazard behaviour of any kind, the rulers will not allow it. No, because it is wrong. Clearly, the next step is for us to do everything we can to make marriages as sacred as possible. And it'll be the most useful marriages which are the sacred ones. Absolutely. What will make them the most useful? Tell me something, Glaucon. I've noticed that as well as hunting dogs you have a fair number of purebred birds in your house. Isn't there one thing you surely must have noticed about their unions and production of children?" "What sort of thing?" he asked. "For a start, though they are all purebred, aren't some of them the best? Don't they prove themselves to be?" "Yes, they do." "Do you, in that case, breed from all of them alike, or are you careful to breed as much as possible from the best?" "I breed from the best." "What about age? Do you breed from the youngest or the oldest? Or do you breed as far as possible from those in their prime?" "From those in their prime. If the breeding is not handled like this, do you think your stock of birds and dogs will greatly deteriorate?" "Yes, I do." "What about horses and other animals?" I asked. "Do you think they're in any way different?" "No, that would be absurd." "Help!" I exclaimed. "We're going to need some extremely expert rulers, my dear friend, if the same applies to the human race as well." "Well, it certainly does apply, but why do they have to be expert?" "I'll tell you. The probability is that our rulers will need to employ a good deal of falsehood and deception for the benefit of those they are ruling. On the principles we have agreed, the best men should have sex with the best women as often as possible, whereas for the worst men and the worst women it should be the reverse. We should bring up the children of the best, but not the children of the worst, if the quality of our herd is to be as high as we can make it. And all this has to happen with no one, apart from the actual rulers, realizing it, if our herd of guardians is also to be as free as possible from dissension." "Quite right. In that case, we must legislate for some festivals, at which we shall bring together the brides and their grooms. We must have sacrifices, and our poets must compose hymns appropriate to the unions which are taking place. We must have lotteries, and pretty ingenious ones, so that every time there is a marriage, the inferior type we want to exclude will blame chance rather than the rulers. They'll have to be extremely ingenious, these lotteries of yours. Presumably, those among the young men who are outstanding in war or any other sphere are to be given various prizes and rewards, and in particular more generous permission to sleep with the women, so that as many of the children as possible can plausibly be fathered by young men of this sort." "That's right. As for the children who will be born from time to time, they will be taken away by officials responsible for these things. These officials may be men or women, or men and women, since offices, I take it, are open to women and men alike." "Yes. The children of good parents will be taken, I think, and transferred to the nursing pen, where there will be special nurses living separately in a special part of the city. The children of inferior parents, on the other hand, or any deformed specimen born to the other group, will be removed from sight into some secret and hidden place, as is right." "Yes," he said, "at any rate, if the breed of guardians is going to remain pure." "Now," I said, "let's continue in a systematic way with the task we set ourselves. We said children should be born to those in their prime." "True. Well, do you agree that a reasonable span for a woman's prime is 20 years, and for a man's 30? "Which 20 and which 30? He asked. "For a woman it means starting at 20 and going on bearing children for the city until 40. For a man, when his days as a sprinter are behind him, then he should father children for the city from that age until 55. "Yes," he agreed, "for both of them that is the prime of life, both physically and mentally." "If someone older or younger than this takes part in producing children for the state, we shall call it an offence against the gods and against justice. And the same law applies if a man who is still entitled to father children gets access to a woman of the appropriate age without a ruler promoting the union. We shall say he is presenting the city with an illegitimate, unauthorized, and unholy child. And we shall be absolutely right," he said. Of course, when women and men pass the age for producing children, we shall declare them free, presumably, to have sex with anyone they like, apart from a daughter, or a mother, or their daughters' daughters, or their mothers' mothers. For a woman, anyone other than a son, or father, or their sons' sons, or fathers' fathers. And all this only when we have first impressed upon them how careful they must be. If there is a pregnancy, then ideally the embryo should never see the light of day. If one does force its way into existence, the parents must deal with it on the understanding that they cannot bring up a child of this sort. That all seems quite reasonable, he said. But this business of fathers and daughters, and the relationships you were talking about just now, how will they tell their own from anyone else's? They won't. When a man takes part in a marriage, he will regard as his children all those born in the 10th month from the day of the festival. He will call the male children his sons, and the female children his daughters. They will call him father. Similarly, he will call the children's offspring his grandchildren, and they in turn will call his generation grandfathers and grandmothers. Those born during the period when their mothers and fathers were producing children, they will call their sisters and brothers. In this way they can avoid one another, as we were suggesting just now. However, the law will allow unions between brothers and sisters, if that is how the lot falls out, and if the Pythian priestess gives her consent as well. Quite right. There you are, Glaucon. That's what it is for women and children to be in common among the guardians of your city. That's what it is like. The next thing we have to do is establish from what has been said that it is consistent with the rest of the Constitution, and that it is by far the best arrangement. Or should we go about things in some other way? No, that's the best way, undoubtedly. If we want to settle this, isn't a good starting point to ask ourselves what is the greatest good we can think of in the organization of our city, the thing the lawgiver should be aiming at as he frames his laws, and what is the greatest evil? Then we can ask, do the proposals we have just described match the features of this good? Do they fail to match the features of this evil? Yes, that's the best possible starting point, he said. Well then, can we think of any greater evil for a city than what tears it apart and turns it into many cities instead of one? Or any greater good than what unites it and makes it one? No, we can't. Is it community of pleasure and pain which unites it, when as far as possible all the citizens are equally affected by joy or grief over any particular gain or loss? It certainly is. And is individual variation in these feelings divisive? Things happen to the city or to its inhabitants which make some people distraught and others delighted. Of course it's divisive. Is this because words like mine and not mine are not applied by everyone in the city to the same things? The same with somebody else's? It certainly is. Does that mean the best regulated city is the one in which the greatest number of people use this phrase mine, or not mine, in the same way, about the same thing? Much the best. When anything at all, good or bad, happens to one of its citizens, a city of this kind will be most inclined to say that what is affected is a part of itself. The whole city will rejoice together, or grieve together. Yes, it's bound to. A city with good laws, that is. This is the moment for us to return to our city, I said, and look for the characteristics our argument has led us to agree on. We want to know if this city possesses them to an outstanding degree, or if some other city does. Yes, we do need to go back and do that. Very well. Presumably, there are rulers and common people, aren't there, in other cities as well as in our city? There are. Do they all call one another citizens? Of course. But in other cities, what else does the common people call the rulers, apart from calling them citizens? In most cities they call them their masters. In democratic cities they just call them rulers. What about the common people in our city? What do they say their rulers are, apart from being citizens? Saviours and defenders, he said. And what do the rulers call the common people? Paymasters and providers. What do the rulers in other cities call their common people? Slaves. And what do the rulers call each other? Fellow rulers. What do ours call each other? Fellow guardians. Can you answer this, then? Would any of the rulers in the other cities find it possible to address one of his fellow rulers as a relative, and another as unrelated? Yes, plenty of them would find that possible. Doesn't such a person think and speak of his relative as his, and one who is unrelated as not his? Yes. What about your guardians? Could any of them think of one of his fellow guardians or address him as if he were unrelated? No, he said. Every time he meets any of them, he will assume he's meeting his brother or sister or father or mother or son or daughter or the child or parent of one of these. In that case, there will be greater agreement in this city than in any other about the terms we were referring to a moment ago. They will say of the success or failure of any individual, "This success is mine," or "This failure is mine." Very true, he said. And did we say that feeling pleasures and pains in common followed from this way of thinking and speaking? We did, and we were right. Then will our citizens more than any others hold one and the same thing, which they will call mine, in common. And because they feel the same about it, will they feel the greatest community of pain and pleasure? Very much the greatest. And the reason for this, over and above the general organization of the city, is the business of women and children being in common among our guardians. Yes, that's the main reason, he said, far more important than anything else. And when it comes to making war, isn't it obvious how they will go about it? How? They will go on campaign together, bringing the most robust of the children with them on active service, so that, like the children of people in other skilled occupations, they can observe the occupation they will have to follow when they grow up. Besides observing, they should act as assistants and servants in everything to do with war, and be some help to their fathers and mothers. Haven't you noticed how people learn a skill? The children of potters, for example, spend a long time as assistants, watching, before they're allowed anywhere near a pot. A very long time. And are potters going to be more careful than our guardians when it comes to educating their own children, giving them the necessary experience and opportunity to observe? No, that would be ludicrous, he said. What is more, any living creature will fight better in the presence of its own young. That's true, but if they are defeated, and these things do happen in time of war, there's a very real danger, Socrates, that along with the guardians themselves, the children will be lost as well, and that this will make recovery impossible for the rest of the city. True, I said. But what is your view on that? Do you think, for instance, that the aim should be to avoid all possible risk? No. Well then, if they are going to take risks, shouldn't it be in situations where success will make them better people? Obviously. Do you think that for men who are going to be warlike it makes very little difference, and is therefore not worth the risk, whether or not they can observe the art of war as children? No, it does make a difference in the way you suggest. What we want to bring about, then, is a way of making the children observers of war, while at the same time thinking of some clever means of ensuring their safety. That would be ideal, wouldn't it? Yes. Well then, I said, for one thing, their fathers will not be without experience. They will be as expert as human beings can be at judging which campaigns are dangerous and which are not. Fair enough. So they will take them on some campaigns, but think twice about others. Yes, that'll be the right approach. And to command them, their fathers will presumably not give them those who are least able, but those well qualified by age and experience to be guides and tutors. Yes, those will be the right people. Will this be enough? I asked. After all, events are unpredictable, as all sorts of people are constantly finding out. They certainly are. So, to meet unpredictable situations, we must give them wings, my friend, from their earliest childhood. Then they can take to flight if they have to. What do you mean? We must put them on horseback at the youngest possible age. Once we have taught them to ride, we can take them as observers, mounted on horses which are not spirited and warlike, but the swiftest and most obedient we can find. In this way they can get an excellent view of what will be their occupation, and still make their escape safely, if the need arises, by following guides who are older than they are. I think that's a good suggestion, he said. What about the actual fighting? I asked. Let's start with their behaviour towards each other. Anyone who out of cowardice leaves his place in the line, throws away his weapons, or does anything of that sort, should be reduced to the rank of skilled worker or farmer. Shouldn't he? He certainly should. Anyone who falls alive into the hands of the enemy can be handed over as a gift to those who capture him. They can do what they like with their catch. By all means. As for someone who wins a prize for valour and distinguishes himself, don't you think that in the first place he should be crowned there in the field by the adolescents and children, every one of them in turn, who are on campaign with him? I do. How about being shaken by the hand? Yes, that too. You won't agree with my next suggestion, I don't suppose. What is it? That he should kiss and be kissed by each of them. That above all, and I propose an amendment to this law. For the duration of the campaign, no one he wants to kiss shall be allowed to refuse. That should make anyone who is in fact in love with someone else, whether that someone is male or female, all the more determined to win a prize. Excellent, I said. After all, it has already been decided that the good man is to get more marriages than other people, and that the good should be selected more frequently than the rest, so that as many children as possible may be born to parents of this kind. Yes, we did decide that. Very well. Then we come to those killed on active service. If anyone dies after covering himself with glory, shall we not say first of all that he is a member of the golden class? We certainly shall. And shall we inquire of Apollo how we ought to bury these superhuman, these divine people, and what mark of distinction we should give them? And shall we then bury them in the way he recommends? We certainly shall. For the rest of time shall we look after their graves as those of superhumans, and bow down before them? Shall we follow this same observance on the death of anyone who is judged to have been outstandingly good in his life, whether he dies from old age or any other cause? Yes, he said, that will be the right thing to do. Now, what about the enemy? How will our soldiers treat them? What do you mean? Take enslavement for a start. Do you think it is right for Greeks to enslave Greek cities? Or should they rather do everything they can to stop any other city doing so? Should they encourage other cities always to spare the Greek race, and so protect themselves against enslavement by the barbarians? Yes, sparing them is far and away the best policy. Is the best thing, then, for them to avoid owning Greek slaves themselves, and also to advise other Greeks not to own them? It certainly is, he said. That way they are likely to turn their attention more towards the barbarians, and leave one another alone. How about plundering the dead? I asked, after a victory. Apart from their weapons, that is. Is that the right thing to do? Doesn't it give cowards an excuse not to go after those who are offering resistance, as if they were performing some useful task in grubbing round the body on their hands and knees? Haven't armies often been lost as a result of this kind of looting? Yes, very often. Besides, doesn't plundering corpses strike you as demeaning and mercenary? Isn't it petty and womanish to go on regarding the body of the dead person as hostile, once the enemy has flown, leaving behind the instrument he was fighting with? Can you see any difference at all between a person behaving like this and dogs which get angry with the stones they are hit by, but show no interest in the person throwing them? No, he said, no difference at all. Should we then put a stop to plundering corpses, and refusing to allow an enemy to take up the dead for burial. We most certainly should. They won't, I imagine, take their weapons to their temples to present as offerings, particularly not the weapons of Greeks, if they are at all interested in maintaining good relations with the rest of Greece. They are more likely to be afraid there may be some pollution in bringing offerings of this kind to a temple from their fellow Greeks, unless, of course, God tells them something different. Quite right. And because they are Greeks, they will not lay waste to Greece, or burn houses, or accept that all the inhabitants of a city, men, women, and children alike, are their enemies. They will regard their enemies at any particular time as few, the ones responsible for the dispute. For all these reasons, they will refuse to lay waste the land or destroy the houses of people whom they mostly regard as their friends. They will pursue their dispute only up to the point where those responsible are compelled by those who are not responsible, and who are suffering as a result, to make amends. For my part, he said, I agree that this is how our citizens should treat their enemies. As for the barbarians, they should treat them in the way Greeks at the moment treat one another. Should we then lay down another law for our guardians, forbidding them to devastate land or burn houses? Yes, we should, and let us by all means lay it down that we are satisfied both with these arrangements and with our earlier ones. The fact is, Socrates, if you're allowed to go on talking about this kind of thing, I don't think you'll ever come back to the question you originally postponed in order to go into all these details. You needn't go on discussing the arrangements. Instead, can we concentrate on giving ourselves a convincing answer to the questions? Are they possible, and how are they possible? We can forget about the rest. That's a very direct assault, I said, on my way of explaining things. You don't have a great deal of sympathy with my misgivings. What you perhaps don't realize, after I have narrowly escaped the first two waves of criticism, is that you are now exposing me to a third, the largest and most threatening of the three. But you will have a lot of sympathy when you see it and hear it. You will see why I hesitated, why I was afraid to put forward such an unlikely-sounding answer for examination. The more excuses you make, the less chance there is that we shall let you off telling us how these political arrangements are possible. Stop playing for time and tell us. Very well then, I said. What is the next question we have to decide? Isn't it which of these people are to rule, and which be ruled? Unquestionably. Is it obvious the rulers should be older, and those who are ruled younger? Yes, it is. And that the rulers should be the best among them? That too. Among farmers, aren't the best ones the ones who most possess the attributes of a farmer? Yes. So in this context, since we are looking for the best of the guardians, must they not be the ones who most possess the attributes of a guardian of the city? Yes. And for this purpose, do they have to be wise, powerful, and above all devoted to the city? They do. And people are most devoted to whatever it is they love. Bound to be. And they love most what they believe to have the same interests as themselves, the thing whose success or failure they think results in their own success or failure. True, he said. Then we must select from the guardians the kind of men who on examination strike us most strongly their whole lives through as being utterly determined to do what is in the city's interests, and as refusing to act in any way against its interests. Yes, they should be the people we want. I think we should observe them at all ages to make sure they are the guardians and defenders of this belief, and that neither magic nor force can make them forget and jettison their conviction that they should do what is best for the city. What do you mean by this jettisoning? He asked. I'll tell you, he said. I think our minds can lose a belief either with or without our consent. With our consent, when it's a false belief, and we learn better, without our consent in the case of all true belief. I understand the loss which is with our consent, but the loss which is without our consent I need to have explained to me. Really? Don't you agree with me that what is good can be taken away from people only without their consent, whereas what is bad is taken away with their consent? Isn't being deceived about the truth something bad, and knowing the truth something good? And don't you think that having a belief which agrees with the way things are is knowing the truth? You're right. When people lose a true belief, it is without their consent. And is that a question of theft, or magic, or force? Once again, I'm afraid I don't see what you mean. I seem to be making myself about as clear as a tragic poet, I said. By theft, I mean people who are talked into changing their minds, and people who forget. Either the passage of time or some process of argument takes away their belief without them realizing it. You do see what I mean now, I hope. Yes. By force, I mean those whom pain or grief causes to change their beliefs. Yes, I understand that as well, he said, and I agree. As for magic, you would also accept, I imagine, that there are people whose beliefs change because they are seduced by pleasure, or because there is something they are afraid of. Yes, all the things which deceive us do look like a form of magic. So, as I said just now, we must look for those who are the best defenders of their conviction that in any situation they must do what they think is in the city's best interests for them to do. From their earliest childhood we must watch them and set them the kind of tasks which can make them lose sight of this aim and lead them astray. Then we must choose the ones who remember their aim and are not easily led astray. Those who are led astray we must reject, mustn't we? Yes. As a second type of test, we must give them hardship, pain, and trials, and in all of them look for the characteristics we want. Correct, he said. Then we must have a third type of test, a test for magic, and watch their reactions to that. Just like people taking young colts close to loud and confused noises, to find out if they are easily frightened, we must expose our guardians, when they are young, first to danger and then to pleasure. We must test them like gold in the fire, only more so. Does this one stand out in every situation as immune to magic and worthy of respect? Is he a good guardian of himself and the musical education he has received? Does he show qualities of rhythm and harmony in all the tests we set him? Is he the kind of person who would be the greatest use to himself and the city? From our children, from our young and grown men, the one who under constant testing emerges as pure is the one who should be appointed as a ruler and guardian of our city. We should heap honours on him in life and in death, and when it comes to burial and other memorials, he should receive the greatest tributes. The one who fails the tests we should reject. Well, Glaucon, so much for my views on the selection and appointment of the rulers and guardians. It's only a general outline, of course, and not a precise specification. I think my views are pretty much the same as yours, he said. In that case, aren't these really the people who can most accurately be called full guardians, making sure friends within do not want to harm it, and enemies without are not able to harm it? The young people whom we have been calling guardians up to now we can call auxiliaries, the defenders of the ruler's beliefs. I agree. In that case, I said, how can we contrive to use one of those necessary falsehoods? We want one single noble lie which will be believed by everybody, including the rulers ideally, but failing that, the rest of the city. What kind of thing do you mean? A very familiar story of Phoenician origin. In the past, so the poets tell us and we believe, it happened in several places, but it has not happened in our time, and I don't even know if it could happen. People would take a lot of persuading. "You seem a bit reluctant to tell your story," he said. "With good reason, as you will see when I do tell you." "Don't worry," he said. "Tell it." "Very well, I will, though I don't know how I shall have the nerve or find the right words. I have to try and persuade, first of all, the rulers themselves and the soldiers, and then the rest of the city, that the entire upbringing and education we gave them, their whole experience of it, happening to them, was, after all, merely a dream, something they imagined, and that in reality they spent that time being formed and raised deep within the earth, themselves, their weapons, and the rest of the equipment which was made for them. When the process of making them was complete, the earth, their mother, released them, and now it is their duty to be responsible for defending the country in which they live against attack, just as they would defend their mother or nurse, and to regard the rest of the citizens as their brothers, born from the earth. No wonder you were so embarrassed about telling us your lie. Yes, I had good reason, I said, but you must listen to the second half of the story as well. You are all brothers, our story will tell them, all of you in the city, but when God made you, he used a mixture of gold in the creation of those of you who were fit to be rulers, which is why they are the most valuable. He used silver for those who were to be auxiliaries, and iron and bronze for the farmers and the rest of the skilled workers. Most of the time you will father children of the same type as yourselves, but because you are all related, occasionally a silver child may be born from a golden parent, or a golden child from a silver parent, and likewise any type from any other type. The first and most important instruction God gives the rulers is that the thing they should be the best guardians of, the thing they should keep the most careful eye on, is the compound of these metals in the souls of the children. If their own child is born with a mixture of bronze or iron in him, they must feel no kind of pity for him, but give him the position in his society his nature deserves, driving him out to join the skilled workers or farmers. On the other hand, any children from those groups born with a mixture of gold or silver should be given recognition and promoted either to the position of guardian or to that of auxiliary. There is a prophecy, God tells them, that the end of the city will come when iron or bronze becomes its guardian. Well, that's the story. Can you think of any possible way of getting people to believe it? No, he said, not the actual people you tell it to, but their children might, and their children after them, and the rest of the population in later generations. Even that might help them to care more about the city and one another. I think I see what you're getting at. Anyway, let that turn out as popular belief and tradition will have it. Our job now is to arm these earth-born warriors of ours and lead them forth with the rulers at their head. Let them go and look for the best place in the city to put their camp, a place from which they can most easily control their own citizens, if any of them refuse to obey the laws or repel any external threats in the event of some enemy coming down on them like a wolf on the fold. When they have set up their camp, they can sacrifice to the appropriate gods, and then organize their sleeping accommodation. Does that sound right? Yes, he said. Should it be the kind of accommodation which will give them adequate shelter, both in winter and summer? Of course. This is their home you're talking about, I take it? Yes, I said, but a home fit for soldiers, not for businessmen. What is the difference in your view? I'll try and tell you. When shepherds are breeding dogs as protectors of their flocks, the worst possible disaster and disgrace, I imagine, is to breed dogs whose nature and training are such that lack of discipline, hunger, or some fault of character leads them to try to attack the sheep themselves and start behaving like wolves instead of dogs. Yes, of course, that's a disaster. In that case, we must guard in every way we can against our auxiliaries doing the same sort of thing to the citizens. After all, they are stronger than the citizens. We don't want them behaving like savage masters instead of friendly allies. Yes, we must guard against that, he said. Won't the best insurance against this be for them to have received a really good education? But they have received one, he said. And I said, we can't be sure of that, my dear Glaucon. What we can be sure about is what we have just been saying, which is that when it comes to gentleness, both to themselves and to those under their protection, then the right education, whatever that may be, is the key. Yes, we're right to be sure of that. In addition to this education, an intelligent observer may say the guardians should be furnished with housing and a general standard of living which will not hinder them from becoming the best possible guardians, and which will give them no encouragement to do wrong in their dealings with the rest of the citizens. He may say that, and he'll be quite right. Well then, I said, do you agree with some suggestions about the way they should live and be housed, if this is what we want them to be like? In the first place, no one is to have any private property beyond what is absolutely essential. Secondly, no one is to have the kind of house or storeroom which cannot be entered by anyone who feels like it. For their subsistence, which should meet the needs of self-disciplined and courageous warrior athletes, they should impose a levy on the rest of the citizens, and receive an annual payment for their role as guardians, which leaves them with neither a surplus nor a deficiency. They should live a communal life, eating together like soldiers in camp. As for gold and silver, they should be told they already have in their souls all the time the divine gold and silver, given to them by the gods. They have no need of human gold in addition, and it is sacrilege to contaminate the divine gold they possess by adding to it a mixture of the perishable gold, since the gold in circulation among ordinary people has been the cause of much evil, whereas their own gold is pure. To them alone, out of the city's population, is it forbidden to handle or touch gold or silver, or be beneath the same roof, or wear it as jewellery, or drink from gold or silver cups. In this way they will be kept safe, and they will keep the city safe. Once they start acquiring their own land, houses and money, they will have become householders and farmers instead of guardians. From being the allies of the other citizens, they will turn into hostile masters. They will spend their whole lives hating and being hated, plotting and being plotted against. Their fears of enemies inside the city will be much more numerous and more acute than their fears of enemies outside the city. Both they, themselves, and the city will be heading at full speed towards imminent destruction. For all these reasons, shall we say that our guardians are to be provided with the housing and way of life we have described? Are these the laws we should enact, or not? They certainly are, said Glaucon. I take it our city, if it has been correctly founded, is wholly good. It can't help being. Clearly, then, it is wise, courageous, self-disciplined, and just. Clearly. Then, as we find each of these elements in it, those we have not yet found will constitute the remainder. Of course. With any four things, if we were looking for one of them in some place or other, and it was the first thing we caught sight of, that would be enough for us. But if we identified the other three first, then the one we were looking for would, ipso facto, have been identified as well, since clearly it could then only be whatever was left. You're right, he said. It's the same for us now. Since there actually are four elements, Should we conduct our search in the same way? Yes, obviously. Well, I think the first one to catch the eye is wisdom, and it seems to have an unusual feature. What is that? It is truly wise, I think, this city we have described. It has good judgment, doesn't it? Yes. Now, this thing, judgment, is clearly knowledge of some sort. Good decisions, I take it, are the result of knowledge, not ignorance. Obviously. But our city contains many types of knowledge, of very different kinds. Of course it does. Is it the knowledge possessed by carpenters which entitle us to call our city wise and say it possesses good judgment? Certainly not, he said. That merely entitles us to call it good at carpentry. So a city is not to be called wise because of its knowledge and judgment in making the best possible wooden furniture. Absolutely not. How about its knowledge of making things out of bronze, or any other knowledge of that kind? No, nothing like that, he said. Nor the knowledge of how to grow crops from the soil, since that's called farming. So I believe. Is there then, I asked, among any of the citizens of this city we have just founded, any branch of knowledge which makes decisions about the city as a whole, deciding on the best policy towards its own members and towards other states, and not about one particular element in the city? There most certainly is. What is this knowledge, and in which group is it to be found? It is the knowledge possessed by the guardians, he said, and it is to be found in the rulers, whom we have just been calling the perfect guardians. And what is the label you give your city on the strength of this knowledge? I call it sound in judgment and truly wise. So, which do you think our city will have more of? Metal workers, or these true guardians? Metal workers, he said, far more. Of all the groups which have a branch of knowledge of their own, and which are identified as a group, wouldn't the guardians be the smallest? Easily the smallest. In which case, the wisdom of a city founded on natural principles depends entirely on its smallest group and element, the leading and ruling element, and the knowledge that element possesses. The class which can be expected to share in this branch of knowledge, which of all branches of knowledge is the only one we can call wisdom, is by its nature, apparently, the smallest class. That's very true, he said. Well, that's one of the four things we were looking for, and we've not only found it, I'm not quite sure how, but also found whereabouts in the city it is located. Nothing much wrong with the way it was found, as far as I'm concerned, he said. Courage next. It is not hard to see both the thing itself and the part of the city in which it is located, the part which gives the city the name courageous. Explain. No one classifying a city as cowardly or brave would look at any other part of it than the part which makes war in the city's defence and serves in its army. Yes, that's the only part anyone would look at, he said. I think the reason for that, I said, is that the cowardice or bravery of the rest of the population would not be enough to make the city itself cowardly or brave. No, it wouldn't. That leaves two things for us to identify in our city, I said. One is self-discipline. The other is the object of our entire investigation. Justice. Yes. Well, is there some way we can find justice without having to bother about self-discipline? I don't know, he said. I wouldn't want it to make its appearance too soon, if that means giving up the search for self-discipline. If I have any say in the matter, please examine self-discipline first. Very well. My first impression is that it is more like a harmony or musical mode than the other two. In what way? Self-discipline, I take it, is a kind of order. They say it is a mastery of pleasures and desires, and a person is described as being in some way or other master of himself. And there are other clues of the same sort in the way it is talked about, aren't there? Indeed there are, he said. But isn't the phrase master of himself an absurdity? The master of himself must surely also be slave to himself, and the slave to himself must be master of himself. It's the same person being talked about all the time. Of course. What this way of speaking seems to me to indicate is that in the soul of a single person there is a better part and a worse part. When the naturally better part is in control of the worse, this is what is meant by master of himself. It is a term of approval. But when as a result of bad upbringing or bad company the better element is too small and is overwhelmed by the volume of the worse element, this is a matter for reproach. They call a person in this condition a slave to himself and undisciplined. Yes, I think that is what it indicates, he said. Now, if you take a look at this new city of ours, you will find one of these situations prevailing. You will admit that it can quite legitimately be called mistress of itself, if something in which the better rules the worse can be called self-disciplined and master of itself. Yes, when I take a look at our city, he said, you are right. But you also find the whole range and variety of desires, pleasures, and pains, particularly in children, women, slaves, and among so-called free men in the majority of ordinary people. You certainly do. Whereas simple, moderate desires, which are guided by rational calculation, using intelligence and correct belief, are things you come across only among a few people, those with the best natural endowment and the best education. True, he said. Well, do you see the same qualities in your city? Are the desires of the ordinary majority controlled by the desires and wisdom of the discerning minority? Yes, they are. So, if any city can be called the mistress of its pleasures and desires and mistress of itself, this one can. It certainly can, he said. In which case, can't we also call it self-disciplined in all these respects? Very much so. What is more, if agreement is to be found among rulers and ruled in any city about which of them is to rule, it is to be found in this one. Don't you think? I couldn't agree more. Well then, when they agree in this way, in which of the two groups of citizens will you say the self-discipline is located, in the rulers or in the ruled? In both, I suppose. See what a plausible prediction we made just now, I said, when we compared self-discipline to a harmony of some sort. Explain. It is not the same as courage and wisdom. Each of those was located in a particular part, yet one of them made the whole city wise, and the other made it brave. Self-discipline does not operate in the same way. It extends literally throughout the entire city, over the whole scale, causing those who are weakest, in intelligence, if you like, or in strength, or again in numbers, wealth, or anything like that, together with those who are strongest, and those in between, to sing in unison. So we would be quite justified in saying that self-discipline is this agreement about which of them should rule, a natural harmony of worse and better, both in the city and in each individual. I quite agree, he said. Very well. 3 of the qualities have been identified in our city, or such is our impression at any rate. What can the remaining quality be which allows a city to share in excellence? Because clearly this is going to be justice. Clearly. Now, Glaucon, this is the moment for us to position ourselves, like huntsmen in a ring round the thicket. We must concentrate and make sure justice does not escape. We don't want it to vanish and disappear from view. It's obviously here somewhere, so keep your eyes open and try your hardest to see where it is. If you see it first, give me a shout." "Some hope," he said. "No, I'm afraid the only help I'm going to be to you is if you want a follower, someone who can see things when they're pointed out to him." "Say a prayer, then, and follow me." "I will. Just you lead the way," he said. "The place is impenetrable," I said, "and full of shadows, and it's certainly dark. Not an easy place to dislodge our quarry from. Still, we must go on." "Yes, we must." And then I caught sight of it. "Ha-ha! Over here, Glorken!" I cried. "This looks like the trail. I think our quarry is not going to escape us after all." "That's good news," he said. "We've been complete idiots." "In what way?" "We're fine ones. It's been lying here under our noses all this time. The principle we laid down right at the start when we first founded our city as something we must stick to throughout. This, I think, or some form of it, is justice. The principle we laid down, and often repeated, if you remember, was that each individual should follow, out of the occupations available in the city, the one for which his natural character best fitted him." "Yes, we did say that. And we have often heard others say, and have often said ourselves, that doing one's own job and not trying to do other people's jobs for them is justice." "Yes, we have said that." "Well, it looks, my friend, as if in some way or other justice is this business of everyone performing his own task. Do you know what makes me think that?" "No, tell me." "I think the remaining element in the city, besides the virtues we've been looking at, self-discipline, courage, and wisdom, is the thing which gave all the others the power to come into being, and the thing whose continued presence keeps them safe once they have come into being. We said earlier that justice would be the one left